Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and I want to thank you for joining me for this week's program. Some of you may have watched Jimmy Evans' program on endtimes.com, and I was on there with him yesterday on his program, and we answered a lot of different questions and talked about some great current developments in news. And at the end of that, he asked me, well, what are you going to talk about on your program this week? And I mentioned to him that I wanted to talk about Egypt and what's happening there, because you'll know that really in the Gaza Strip right now, that Israel's kind of making one final assault on a place called Rafah. And Rafah is down the far southwest corner of the Gaza Strip, and 1.4 million people have been concentrated there, and really it's the final stronghold for Hamas. So Israel is focusing their attention there to finally end Hamas, at least they're in Gaza, once and for all. Now Rafah, this place in Gaza, is right on the border with Egypt. And so what happened in the last few days is that Egypt was beginning to make some threats that if Israel persisted in their assault against Rafah, that Egypt might rescind their peace treaty with Israel from all the way back in 1979, back at the Camp David Accords that was brokered by President Jimmy Carter. So that would be a huge development for Israel, because ever since 1979, Israel's not really had to guard their southern border because they have peace with Egypt. Before they always had to be guarding their northern border against Syria and Lebanon, and they also had to guard that southern border. But since 1979, they've not had to do that, which has been a huge advantage. So I was going to talk about that on today's program, but fortunately, and this is good news, Egypt has backed off from those threats. And they're saying that there's no threat that they're going to rescind the 1979 peace treaty with Israel from the Camp David Accords. So that's a great development. That's an encouraging development there, that Israel at least doesn't have to deal with Egypt in going down and trying to obliterate and finally wipe out Hamas there in Rafah. So we'll be keeping our eyes on those developments there. But since that issue has changed for the better, what I want to talk about on today's program is the escalating conflict or showdown between Russia and Europe. I mean, it's really a ratcheting up. Putin is upping the ante greatly right now with Europe. So I want to talk about that here in just a few moments. But first, let me mention that we'll go to the subscriber only section here in a bit, and I'm going to answer some questions. One question is, who's the army that surrounds God's people in the city of Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 20 at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ? Who are these people, and where do they come from? Another question about the red heifer is, if Jesus died to do away with sacrificing animals for sins, why is sacrificing a red heifer such a big part of the end times timeline? Since, as this question asks, is that really necessary anymore? And then one other question, if there's no conflict in heaven, why does heaven have an army? So we'll get to those questions in here a little bit in the subscriber only section. But I want to again talk about Vladimir Putin and Russia and Europe. So Putin versus the EU and versus NATO. Now, obviously, the reason this is significant is because in Ezekiel 38 and 39, Rosh and Magog, part of modern-day Russia, are the leaders of an invasion of Israel in the end times. And their leader is a person named Gog. Now, that may not be the person's actual name, but Gog means darkness. So it's just kind of a metaphor, a picture of what this person will be like. Now, Russia has been in the news even more in the last few days because of some comments that President Trump made about NATO and the nations there contributing financially to support what's happening there. And also a very extensive, long interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. So a lot's been going on, lots been being talked about Russia. But what I want to do is just go through 4 different articles that really underscore the heightening tensions between Vladimir Putin and the West. So the first article here is from Business Insider. It says Russia fired Putin's invincible hypersonic Zircon missile for the first time in Ukraine. So sometime back, Russia has developed this Zircon missile. So it's a hypersonic missile, and Vladimir Putin claims it's invincible. And they fired that for the first time in Ukraine. And it says this missile is launched from a ship and can reach speeds to Mach 6 to Mach 8, or between 4,500 miles per hour and 6,000 miles per hour. This means it can fly 8 times the speed of sound. Russian officials claim it can actually travel at Mach 9, or about 6,900 miles per hour. Vladimir Putin has called this weapon invincible. And one part of the article says when an object travels at Mach 5 or faster, it ionizes the air around it and creates a plasma sheath that obstructs radar signals, which is an issue when approaching moving targets. So this has been fired, this missile has, for the first time in Ukraine. And so this is a major development really in the war there. Now, thinking about Vladimir Putin and Russia versus NATO, an article in USA Today says Putin plans to double Russia's troops along NATO border. So you'll remember that NATO had 30 nations in NATO. Last year, they added Finland. And that's very important because Finland has an 830-mile-long border with Russia. Now, this is a terrible development for Putin. He hated this, that now they've got this 830-mile border with a NATO country. Also, Sweden, probably here in the very near future, will be the 32nd NATO country. Turkey kind of stood in the way of this, as did Hungary, but Turkey now has said that they've paved the way for Sweden to be part of NATO, and Hungary has pretty much done the same thing. So Sweden will be admitted. But Vladimir Putin is doubling his troops along the NATO border. And it says that Russia has chosen a path which is a long-term confrontation. Now, the article says that Russia, it's highly unlikely that they'll attack a NATO country in the short term, but that Vladimir Putin is kind of playing a long game here, and that he's doubling his troops along the NATO border, probably for something he plans to do in the future. So that's something to keep our eyes on. But another article says Russia could attack a NATO country within 3 to 5 years, Denmark warns. So Denmark is warning that Vladimir Putin could attack a NATO country in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, when you think about NATO, remember with NATO, there'll be 32 countries soon, and there's a provision in the NATO charter called Article 5. And that is, if one nation is attacked, that's as if all the nations are attacked. And so if Russia did attack a NATO country, that really would trigger World War III. But the article says Russia could attack a NATO country in as little as 3 years. This is the starkest warning from a Western official about Moscow's appetite for confrontation beyond its war in Ukraine. The article goes on to say Russia's increased defense spending potential is leading to a direct confrontation with NATO. They're building up their military in a much greater way, at a much greater rate than they have in the past. Russia has rebooted its military industrial complex and secured weapons from Iran and from North Korea. The article goes on to say Russia's capacity to produce military equipment has increased tremendously. Russia potentially has the will to launch attacks. Now they can have the ability in terms of military capability earlier than we expected. They're producing massive amounts of ammunition. And the speculation is that Russia, the first nation it would attack is Moldova, and then the Western Balkans if it is able to succeed in Ukraine. And here's what this article then goes on to say. This is a leader from the Romanian armed forces. Says the Russian Federation will not stop here. If Putin wins in Ukraine, the main target will be the Republic of Moldova. We'll witness tensions in the Western Balkans. I'm more than convinced that Putin's policy will escalate in the immediate future. Then he says the people of Romania, as all of Europe, must be concerned and prepare accordingly. So it's just continuing to build and escalate to this showdown. And then one final article says the EU takes its first step to use Russians' frozen assets for Ukraine. So this is something else that Vladimir Putin is very aggravated about, is a lot of money that was in Europe, Russian money, that's been frozen there. The EU is going to use the profits from that money to help support Ukraine. Now, they haven't taken the money itself. The U.S. actually wants to confiscate all of those assets. But it's about $323 billion. But the EU doesn't want to do that. What they want to do is they want to just take the profits from that and reinvest that into Ukraine. But again, it's just another thorn in the side of Vladimir Putin to just kind of keep heightening these tensions between Russia and Europe. And so all of this is leading ultimately to a showdown. I mean, it just continues to build the tensions really on every front. And when you think about the prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 38, the Gog-Magog invasion of Israel, when that invasion takes place, Gog, this leader of Russia and this coalition, he'll be that great northern leader. But the leader of the West, of Europe, will be the Antichrist. He'll be leading the reunited Roman Empire. And my view is that when the Gog-Magog invasion occurs, it'll be the first half of that 3.5-year tribulation period. Because it says in Ezekiel 38, Israel will be at rest and living securely when that invasion occurs. It says that in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 8 and verse 11. So Israel will be living under a kind of a guaranteed peace or a security with the Antichrist or with the West. So whenever Gog and Magog and Russia and these nations invade Israel in Ezekiel 38, it will be an attack against Israel, but by extension, it will be an attack against the Antichrist in the West because they have a treaty with the nation of Israel. So Gog is the leader of Russia, this northern confederacy of nations. He's not the same as the Antichrist. In fact, they'll be enemies. So when Russia attacks Israel in Ezekiel 38, it's really an attack as well against the West. And so we see how all of this is building and setting the stage for what the Bible predicts. So what we see happening right now is the buildup. And so what do we see in Israel? Everybody keeps talking about a ceasefire and peace there and a two-state solution. And the only one who's going to be able to come along and solve that at some time will be this Western ruler, this European ruler of the Antichrist. And when he makes that covenant, then Russia, who has building tensions with the West right now with Europe, will come in and attack Israel. And in so doing, will also attack the West. So what I'm saying is you look at all this, we can see how the puzzle pieces are being set in place. And all of this should be an indication to us that the rapture could happen very, very soon. Well, thank you for joining us for the program today. I'm going to go now to those questions that I mentioned earlier. If you're not a subscriber at endtimes.com, you can go to that website, the endtime.com, and sign up for $7 a month. And we'd love to have you be part of this ministry. So we'll go now to those questions and answer those.